I want you to imagine what it's like when you've made a commitment to preaching through a book of the Bible, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. There's a lot to be said for this. I actually believe in this, and every time that I have served as a pastor, I have practiced just this, including going through the book of Genesis. But one of the pitfalls that comes with that is when you come to those chapters that have information that seems like it would be important for historians, for scribes, for genealogists, but it's not exactly easy to discern in this, a chapter filled with a list of difficult to pronounce names, how it is that it applies to us in our circumstance. Well, we've seen a little bit of that already in Genesis chapter 5, but we're blessed as we're reading through Genesis chapter 5 to be mentioned in the side the story of Enoch, the name of Methuselah, the birth of Noah. These kinds of things are there reminding us and giving us sort of a stopping off point to give a little bit of the backstory. And then we get more narrative, and we get the flood and the end of the flood and Noah's sin, and now we come to Genesis chapter 10 rather. And wow, there's a lot of names, a lot of difficult names, and not a lot of asides on what we really know about these names. But it's still helpful for us to know, and I'm reminded of this because right now, part of my life is walking alongside my wife as she is back in school, seeking to secure an advanced degree in her field. And part of that process is a requirement that she take some required courses in the college that she's enrolled in, and one of those required courses that she's taking right now is essentially a history of civilization. And so I've been reading alongside of her, and we've gotten through, or I guess, through the end of the Roman Empire historically. But you get information, you gather stuff that you didn't know. Just yesterday, I was reading about the relationship between Egypt, Cush, and Sheba. Maybe one other name that I have forgotten. But, if you remember, we were familiar with Egypt as part of the story in Exodus, an important part of the story. We remember that Moses' sister and Aaron get upset at Moses because he's married to a Nubian among his wives. And then later on in the ministry of and life and work of Solomon, we get a visit from the Queen of Sheba. These are all similar places, all kind of on the northeast corner of Africa, maybe going farther south as you go along the way from Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, Cush, and Seba or Sheba. Well, it's fun for me as someone who has a little bit of familiarity with biblical history to be able to see some of these names and some of these cities. Now, I don't know that historians have been zealous to either attack the veracity of Scripture or defend the veracity of Scripture in these contexts. But again, it's interesting as you read the book of beginnings to see things that match. One of the other things that matches is one of these asides that we are given in the Genesis chapter 10, and that is about Nimrod. Nimrod, who is described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, if you remember, when we went through Genesis chapter 5 in the long list of names, I suggested to you that this was all part of the setup to deal with how it is that the earth became so vile and so wicked. And if you remember in Genesis chapter 6, I made the argument that the intermarrying of the sons of God and the daughters of men is probably not, and I'm not trying to be dogmatic about this, but probably not demons interbreeding with humans. One of my arguments there is, of course, that demons don't breed. They don't even have bodies by which to breed. They can appear in human form, but they don't have bodies. But the point of the chapter is to say, look, the good guys and the bad guys, remembering that everybody's a sinner, but those who called upon the name of the Lord, the sons of Seth, are finding the daughters of Cain to be attractive, and they intermarry with them, and everything becomes wicked and evil. Well, what we're, as we've said before, we have a new beginning, a new garden, even a new temptation in the life and ministry of Noah. And we have a new fall with Noah getting drunk, and we have the spread of sin within the family with Ham mistreating his father in his drunkenness. So, all of this to say, you have a recapitulation of what has gone before, and so we should not be surprised that as we read in Genesis chapter 10, we're seeing again the descendants spreading, and just as we had with Lamech, when Lamech was described as a great and mighty man, and he wrote his sword song, and he celebrated his right of vengeance, now comes Nimrod. Well, Nimrod is described in our Bibles as a mighty hunter before the Lord. And, one could almost see this as, or not almost, one could see this as a positive thing, that this is describing Nimrod as a fellow who's quite gifted by God as a hunter, and that God blesses him in his hunting, and he's such a powerful and good hunter that his name is remembered, and that's why it's recorded here. Well, probably not. That English language before the Lord, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, comes from a Hebrew that could just as well be communicating that he was a mighty hunter, in a sense, in the face of the Lord, that he stood up to the Lord, that he rebelled against the Lord, that he was essentially the leader of those who would cease to follow in the ways of his grandfather, Noah, in calling upon the name of the Lord. Now, I have to be very careful here because I've got this chapter full of names, and the big name that stands out is Nimrod, to not step on my own toes, because the next time we need to go into Genesis chapter 11 and there talk about the Tower of Babel. But there is a long history and tradition. No, it is absolutely true that the Bible does not say this explicitly at all. There's a long tradition that says of Nimrod that he was the one who led the building of the Tower of Babel. The Jewish historian Josephus, who has been so helpful to us in helping us understand ancient history. He lived in the 1st century and is the preeminent historian of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He had this to say about Nimrod and his character, and again, we'll see this laid out further in the next chapter. He wrote, "Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy. but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again. For that he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying his forefathers. That's Josephus writing roughly 2,000 years ago about this Nimrod. Now, tying together the biblical account of Nimrod and my reading of ancient history, one of the things that we discover is that Nimrod as a character, which I don't mean to suggest he wasn't real, but Nimrod appears in the literature of multiple cultures besides the Hebrew culture. That there's a guy who fits much the same description who shows up in Arabic literature and in other literature of that era. Now, that, of course, should also not surprise us. If he lived in a time when people were of one tongue, of one lip, of one sort of grouping, then it shouldn't surprise us that when this split happens, which we'll look at next time, that they would have that shared memory. But I want you to notice something here in what Josephus tells us. I think it's important. I think it also ties in with what I've been reading in my wife's history book. And that is this. We read very early on in our textbook that the pharaohs, one of the reasons or one of the ways by which the pharaohs came to be worshipped as gods on earth was they presented themselves as being the ones who were responsible for the prosperity and the security that Egypt enjoyed. Now, those two things were deeply tied together. That is, the security and the prosperity. They were in a place where they were able to give themselves to trade, which tends towards prosperity. They had the Nile River, which was able to provide plenty of water for plenty of farming, which moved towards their prosperity. But they also had natural borders, deserts on two sides, water on other sides, and they were able to, not live in fear of being invaded and attacked and assaulted. And so out of that came this prosperity, but the pharaohs took credit. And out of that came the worship of them. This is profoundly common. When you look at the worship of the dictator in North Korea, when you look at how Stalin and Lenin were idealized and entombed, all of this, the whole Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong, all of these megalomaniac rulers didn't just do this out of raw wickedness. Certainly they were wicked, but it was also a political ploy. It was a way to keep people under control. And it was rebellion against the living God. Now let me go back to the early part of the Christian church to illustrate this. We have this image, rightly so, of Roman emperors like Caligula or Nero, and they were just sort of insane and given to such excess. And out of this came this hatred of Christians and the bloodthirstiness of the people, and that's why they went to their deaths in the Colosseums. etc., etc. And there's some truth to that, but there's more truth to this. One of the things that was a genius move by the Romans when they created their empire was they allowed the people that they conquered to continue with their own religious beliefs and practices. According to Rome, they didn't care whether you were Jewish, whether you were Zoroastrian, they didn't care what you worshipped. Didn't matter to them. As long as you were willing to acknowledge the lordship of Caesar. Do you understand that all of those Christians that were put to death, that were tied to stakes, covered with pitch and lit on fire in the gardens of Nero, that were crucified and lined along the Appian Way for mile after mile, that this happened in a sense not because the Christians were not in line theologically, but because they were not in line politically. Because they would not confess the Roman Pledge of Allegiance, which reads, Kaiser ho Kyrios. That was the sole requirement for security and safety inside Rome. If you would just say those three words, Kaiser ho Kyrios, which are Greek meaning Caesar is Lord. Now, it shouldn't surprise you to know that the very first creed of the Christian church, even before the Apostles' Creed, was this three-word creed, Christos ho Kyrios. The Christians went to their death because they recognized the lordship of Jesus Christ over the reign of Caesar. They did recognize, as the book of Romans tells us, that Caesar's authority came from Jesus, that all the governments that exist by his determination. But what they don't do, what they can't do, is demand our loyalty above our loyalty to Christ. Well, in a manner of speaking, what Nimrod was doing in these early days after the flood was much the same thing, and doing it profoundly successfully, leading the people away from the worship of the living God and encouraging them to see himself as the source of their security, the source of their well-being, the source of their wealth. He was putting himself in the place of God, which is exactly what governments that will not acknowledge the lordship of Christ will always do. So what we're watching here, this is a strange world to us. Remember, this is the great-grandson of Noah. This is way back. Noah lived pre-flood, so this is the great-grandson of someone who lived pre-flood. Way back. And yet the issues and the struggles are the same. Where do we find our security? Where do we find our peace? Who is the one who gives us our law? God or government? Well, we're going to see, in a manner of speaking, the pinnacle of this rebellion against the authority of God when next time we come to Genesis chapter 11 and look at the Tower of Babel. Let me close today by reminding you of something very important. I'm going to keep reminding you of this all the way through. Because this was such a long time ago, because this is so distant, because these stories are so fantastic, and perhaps even because when we were little children, when we read these stories, they were illustrated with cartoon people or vegetables. We need to remember that this actually happened in space and in time. So I look forward to next time when we have the opportunity to talk about the absolute world-changing events around the building of the Tower of Babel and God coming down to this tower up to heaven to confuse and spread his own creation around the world.